Good morning or good afternoon. It is 12:34 here on a Saturday, pretty overcasty day, kind of a rainy day, but hope everyone's doing good. The so this is going to be the next video for my next franchise. I've been covering all of the vampire movies in the Hammer series. The Hammer movie series is one of my all-time favorites. This is probably, I think, the fourth video. There's about two more to go, I think. And I've been watching each of these films in succession, so it's been really wonderful. Again, I've seen all of these movies countless amounts of times. These are all the Dracula movies starring the iconic Christopher Lee and also starring his great friend in real life and also another horror icon, Peter Cushing. He typically always played a form or played the character of Van Helsing. So this has been a blast. I've done a handful of franchise videos. I did the Friday 13th series. I did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. I also have done the Halloween franchise. I did one about a week ago on the Evil Dead franchise. So this is my next one, and this is a series that really goes back to my childhood. So it's even more of a, well, it's kind of out of a nostalgic thing too, but it's even more in that regard, kind of a personal thing. You know, I think the two franchises, horror franchises that go back the furthest back in time for me, or bring me back to my childhood, and when I first experienced horror, was the Friday 13th franchise and the Hammer films, the classic British horror company that put out all of these wonderful horror movies for decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. And then the whole reason that the reason I got this idea to do a show of where I covered this franchise was because I did a show last week on The Kill List, which is a newer film, another British film, but it was also put out by the Hammer Company, and it's one of their newer, more recent films, even though that film now is old. And there's been a few since then. That's when I realized, oh wait, I gotta, I have to do this. I have to do a show on the Hammer series because these films are just such an integral part of my youth. So this show is going to be about Dracula AD, and this one is a pretty awesome movie. They're all great. We all have our favorites in this series. My favorites, I have to say so far, are Dracula's Risen from His Grave. That's probably my favorite film. I really love the Satanic Rites of Dracula. I think that's just a bonkers movie. I love that movie. I just finished watching that the other night, and then I also did a show on that. And this one, Dracula AD, is one of my favorites. They're probably my favorite films in the entire series. I've seen all of them countless amounts of times, but those three, for some reason, just pop out at me. And I love all of the films. They're all just completely bonkers and crazy in their own way, because the reason is I think because they're so far removed from the original novel of, like Bram Stoker created or had written of Dracula. You talk about films, and sometimes where you have source material, books that are famous, and then there's all these film adaptations of that story. I think the adaptations of Dracula based around the book, I think these films are probably the most the biggest example of a kind of a left turn from that. Like, they don't really have anything to do with the story, which I think is good. I think in some ways it's really great. I've talked about that where, they're really campy and they're really silly. But I've talked about that in a couple of the videos of where Christopher Lee was always at odds with the Hammer Studios. He loved the source material, and he wanted the movies to be more geared towards the direction of where it was taken from the original book and that narrative. But they went, the various directors, and the company itself of Hammer, they wanted to take it in, a much different direction. So the only similarities that they have are the principal characters. You have Dracula, Van Helsing, and Lucy. That essentially, after that, they're maybe one or two other characters. Other than that, they're completely so incredibly far removed. I did a show a few weeks ago on this movie that I just discovered called Frankenstein vs. Dracula. And that movie is like just completely bananas and insane. It's one of my favorite. It was a movie I had seen and heard a lot about over the years, and it's from the 70s, and it's like the definition of pure horror exploitation. I mean, it's so completely ridiculous and ludicrous, but I love that movie to death. And that's one of my favorite. And again, I just bought that film. I just saw it for the first time. I've seen it a handful of times since I bought it, and I just bought it maybe last month. And I've watched that movie a bunch of times, and I really love that movie. That's one of my favorite movies. The movie is so, considering how absurd and ridiculous the film is, there's something about it that I just love. And I kind of feel that same kind of connection with these Hammer films. They've always had that kind of quality, also. And Dracula AD is no exception. It takes place in the 70s. It actually came out in 1972. The period that this film takes place is in 73. So it's, the music is in the fashion. It's just crazy. And the whole story is Van Helsing dispatches Dracula to his grave, only for the Dark Lord to be reborn in 1972. When the swinging Trendles of London decide to experiment with a little devil worship, the Count decides to move on his own bloody groove. So basically, it's centered around, the story of this movie is centered around this group of these like party going group of teenagers that want to experiment with satanic rituals. So one of the guys in the group who kind of initiates this whole thing, they're all into taking all kinds of drugs and trying to experiment sexually, all kinds of ways, trying all kinds of ways to expand their mind. Definitely kind of a play on the whole 60s movement. And this guy in particular has a real interest in the occult, so he has this thing of where he decides to bring this. This group wants to have all these new experiences, so he assembles this crew of his friends to where they conduct this ritual, satanic ritual, if you want to call it that, where they basically invoke the Prince of Darkness, and at the same time they're actually invoking Dracula, who is the Prince of Darkness. And it's hilarious. It's great. It's wonderfully campy. It's completely ridiculous. I love the whole aesthetic around the film because it's so 70s, and it's got all this great like kind of acid rock, funk music. The fashion's awesome. The music is just killer. Like I said, it's a great movie. And again, it's so different than the other films. Each film is really different. They really, they do stick. And I'm watching these films more or less in order that they came out, more or less. But they kind of do stick to to some kind of storyline, to like along with its with its predecessor. But for the most part, they do go off the rails, and they do try to attempt, maybe not success. They're maybe not they're not 100% successful, meaning like Hammer Studios, but they try to like create these standalone movies. But they're so freaking entertaining, and I've always loved this movie. I've seen this movie Dracula AD, countless times. So, I really, really love this entire franchise. This was my first introduction to the character of Dracula. In the first movie I did in this whole series, Dracula's risen from his grave, which came out in 1958. When you think of how, and here we are, 2023, how popular vampire movies are, and to think that these things were happening, in the 50s and 60s, and then when you want to trace it back even further, Fitz Lang, or you could take, with Nosferatu, and obviously Bela Lugosi, and you might be able to find something even before that. But the popularity of Dracula and vampirism and that whole world, it's pretty unbelievable how far it's come, but then how much it's loved, and it's kind of a part of our American fabric as a culture, and it's I would say in the whole you look at the big picture of what horror the genre is in general. I think it's pretty safe to say that anything tied to vampires is still the most popular. I mean, when you think of the amount of movies that have come out and that still come out, it's pretty staggering. But for me personally, what the Hammer Studios did, that was my introduction. That was the first time I had ever come across Dracula. I watched those movies for quite a few years as a kid growing up. I used to watch them on cable, and then when VHS was a thing, and it was in my very, very early part of my youth, that was the thing where I would rent all of those movies all the time on VHS. And so it was just a wonderful time period. And I didn't read the original source material, Bram Stoker's original novel, Dracula. I didn't read that until I was like maybe a senior in high school or maybe even in college. But it was quite a few years later that I actually read the book, and I realized how incredibly different this whole thing was, what Hammer was doing. But just an amazing film. This whole collection is great. I've said too before, unfortunately, I don't have these movies on Blu-ray. I only have one film on Blu-ray, and that is Scars of Dracula. And it's not even, it's an okay edition. I mean, there is some really great interviews with Christopher Lee, but the quality's pretty good. But I'm looking to eventually buy all these films, like get a really great 4K Blu-ray edition of each of these films, because it just has to happen. So please check out these Hammer films. This whole series I wanted to just center on the Dracula films starring the iconic Christopher Lee. Probably overall my favorite actor in horror. I should say, Hammer also did other styles of horror films. They also incorporated other Universal monsters, like the Universal monsters that exist, that were, unleashed to the world in the 20s and 30s with, Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein, Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Wolfman, Bela Lugosi playing Dracula, and then they also introduced the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. So many great characters, iconic characters. And so Hammer Studios also did other adaptations of those monsters. They did quite a few Frankenstein adaptations, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and what have you. And most of those films also star Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. But I wanted for this series to just focus, and I love those movies very much so. And eventually, I'll probably do shows on those movies. But my jam, my favorite are is anything tied to Christopher Lee and the incredible Dracula films. There was about 7 to 10 films, I believe, that he was involved in. So yeah, just if you're new to anything like in the old school terms to to Dracula, to vampire films, if you have a deep love for that world, I definitely recommend checking out the Hammer series. They're so awesome. And they're super cheesy and ridiculous and just over the top, but that's what makes them amazing. So I highly recommend checking out these films if you haven't already. So, and thanks again for people checking out this channel. If you like this page, please like and subscribe to it. Keep the comments coming, and we will see you next time for the next installment of Dracula. Peace.